you've snagged it on something, maybe you've dropped it.
Or you pulled it apart and your little boy gets to it and smashes it on the counter.
Yes.
Not saying that really happened.
Well, and this is why the airbrush has that outermost needle cap, is so that we don't have an exposed needle that can drag and get and snag on things. And fortunately, in the cake decorating world, a little bit of a bent needle isn't really going to affect performance. If it gets bent as bad as what we see here, you're going to have real problems. It's going to spray sideways. That cone of airbrush color isn't going to be even. It's going to be lopsided. It's going to be going off to the side. And if it's hooked, like you see in this illustration, if you pull the needle back, it's not going to come all the way back. You're not going to be able to get all your paint flow, and you're going to be, instead of sliding all the way back through the nozzle cap as it's supposed to, as we saw in the cutaway, all of a sudden now it's going to be stopped at the very delicate end of that nozzle cap, and we're going to start creating damage there. So if you can't pull a needle out of an airbrush, maybe it's dried in place because you're as abusive to your equipment as I am. Maybe it's dropped on the floor. Maybe you're troubleshooting it and need to do a cleaning. If you can't pull that needle out, before you start taking pliers and having at, take a look at that needle. Make sure it's straight. Make sure that you're not damaging your nozzle cap by just trying to get that needle out. The needle is going to wear out, and it can be, it's like a $10, $15 part, depending on the make, model of the airbrush. Mm-hmm. That nozzle cap can be $25 to $50, depending on the make, model, and brand. The nozzle cap is a more expensive part because there's more engineering involved. So we'd rather replace a needle and have to work on that than have to worry about replacing the fluid nozzle as well. So the next slide shows what happens to that poor nozzle.
There you go. Oh, dang
there
it.
We go. And normal wear and tear, and I'm talking years of use. If nothing else, you don't have any other bad luck. Normal wear and tear, that nozzle will eventually split because it repeatedly is having that needle slide forward and meet it. So it's going to eventually just flex enough to wear out. Mm-hmm. It'll start splitting. We can force it to split if we shove that needle too far forward. We'll splay it out just like a banana peel. If our needle was hooked too bad and we just try ripping it back out, it can force a tear the other way. Your airbrush is going to work if this is what's going on right now. If you have this, and again, it can be very difficult to see. You're going to need your magnifying glass, or with some experience, you can feel along the edges of the fluid nozzle and you can feel whether it's got a burr on it or not. But just a black line can be a split nozzle, or if it's really bad, it's going to be splayed open like you see in the illustration. And yeah, it's not going to work at all. Maybe you might be able to get a sputter line, but it needs to replace. There is no fixing this.
Okay, great. Just for all of you guys that are out there, again, just to repeat, if you have questions for Lisa throughout all of this, that's what we're here for, is to answer your questions. So in that chat box, make sure that you're asking the questions that you have for Lisa. If you have an airbrush that's having a specific problem, go ahead and ask that, and we'll see if we can get that answered for you. If it's not, if it's just a technique thing, go ahead and ask that.
Ask it away. Now that I've scared everybody.
No, you're totally fine.
Well, let's talk a little bit about just color, and so get away from all the engineering, intimidating stuff. You had laying down color. It was 3 little pictures, 3 little piles of lines and dots and squiggles. So let's go to that because it's a little bit more. Yeah.
I didn't have it in the right order, apparently. Oh, there you
That's
go.
okay. There we go. All right. That top one is if I hand painted color, it's going to lay down like cornflakes. So my brush is going to
Yes.
be laying down pigment and paint, and it's, again, cornflakes is a perfect analogy. So very, very thick, very chunkier application. If I take that exact same product and put it through an airbrush, that's what you see in that middle picture. So that paint, instead of big chunky flakes, is going to be tiny, tiny little dots. That's atomized paint. It's the mist of color. So it will be much thinner application of color to get the same amount of coverage as hand painting. That's one of the advantages of the airbrush, is nice, even color. Now that bottom picture, you'll see that, yes, we've got our little circles of color, but that you've also got these little white ovals. This is what we get when we're airbrushing pearls and micas that have a color. The pearls and micas, these colors are always going to be more transparent. They're going to be more sheer, because they have to be. Because if I had enough paint in there to completely color and have an opaque color, I would be painting my pearl, and the pearl wouldn't have any effect. So I see people and I get questions, I'm doing a blue pearl, my cake isn't blue, I get enough color on there for it to be the color I want, it's a wet, soggy mess. And that's why, because you're trying to get a color coverage out of a pearl that it's not necessarily designed to do. And if it is a color that's dark enough, and it doesn't have as much shimmer as I was expecting. All the airbrush color manufacturers are trying to hit that happy balance between how solid the color is and how much shimmer it has. That's why in class I teach airbrush a blue base and then airbrush with a blue pearl. You get a lot more intensity of color. It doesn't take any longer, but you're using a lot less product and you have a lot better intensity payoff. So as an area of troubleshooting, understanding how these colors layer and how pearls work, it can be a big help. This is a fun technique. This is splattering. So the cake back that you're looking at, this is all colored cocoa butter. So I've got a fondant base, white fondant base, and I've airbrushed a tan gradient. And then I've gone in and done some hand layering, some sponge work, and then hand painting of 3 layered colors. What I wanted to do to really keep this scroll work looking modern is I wanted to have a nice speckle splatter texture to it. So this is an old 80s t-shirt artist trick. You take a craft stick, and you'll see I'm resting the airbrush on that craft stick. And I'm airbrushing my color at an angle down onto the craft stick, and then all the extra air is taking that puddle that I've made on the end of the craft stick and flinging it across onto the cake. So you can see I've got some smaller splatters and larger splatters. The angle of the airbrush resting on the craft stick, the higher and lower the angle, it changes the size of the splatter from very fine sand all the way up through the bigger, bigger, almost dripping that you can get for splats. So this is a fun technique for, again, sand, natural coverage. Maybe you want to do some big dripping blood for a Halloween cake. You can go all the way up to just absolutely wild and crazy. So it's a nice way to create texture. So that's why I included it in there. I thought it'd be fun. When I'm demonstrating, everybody always gets excited about this because it's a lot of fun to play with.
It is really fun. I mean, I've seen this picture of yours on your Facebook page, this cake, and I loved it. And I really didn't look as closely as I should have, I guess, to see how it had those splatters on it. But honestly, there was a picture of a textured, just a scrapbook page that I really thought was gorgeous, and I wanted to duplicate this, but I just didn't know how to get it to look that way. I could do mostly everything, but it had speckles on it, and I just was, oh, how do I get that? How do I get that? And this right here is the answer. This is it.
The non-airbrush way to get those speckles is to take an old toothbrush or an old scrubby chipboard paintbrush and dip just the end bristles, like an eighth of an inch, just get a little bit of coverage on them, and then you got to take your finger and you got to flick it across, and that works, but obviously it's a lot messier.
Yes. Yeah. I love this technique.
It does take a little bit getting used to. When I did this cake, I had another piece over to the side, so I could make sure everything was in harmony. I could get my angle. I could basically warm up before I actually hit my cake. So I do advise that with this technique. Just like with the hand painting, I'm going to have a little practice pad, and I'm going to get the hand flow and everything all warmed up and make sure everything is properly flowing right, my paintbrush is happy before I start painting my scroll work. So it's no different with the airbrush. I'm sure I don't do a lot of piping, but I'm sure with hands you're going to do a little bit of practicing off to the side before you hit that cake. You're going to just make sure everything is a proper consistency before you start piping. So it's the exact same mentality.